Hey, thanks everyone for coming. This is our panel on infrastructure, innovating infrastructure, laying the foundation for Texas's future. If that's not the panel you want to do, then there are two others over here. But I think everyone's here for that. Historically, I would say going back at least 4 years, the Policy Summit, we've always had a panel on the grid, because that's always been an issue, even before Winter Storm Uri. But you got to mix it up a little bit every year, and so we're going to talk about the grid a little bit. That's kind of the area of expertise for myself and Mike. But we want to talk a little bit more about water infrastructure as well, something that the foundation is starting to kind of work its way into that area. Again, we've had back when Kathleen Hartnett-White was with us and former TCEQ chairman, she did some stuff with water, but and me kind of taking her place. I don't have any expertise in that, but we have our new policy analyst, Leah Formont, has some background in that, and then we've gotten Larry to help out a little bit with writing a paper and doing some other things on that issue. So we wanted to kind of bring that in, since water is of equal importance to the state as energy, and they're both intricately linked. So I think hopefully you'll enjoy the discussion with two, I would say, of the two best people in Texas we could get to come talk, I think, are with us, if I can say so myself. So with that said, let me introduce the panelists. Larry French, he's a senior visiting fellow for water policy at TPPF. In 2022, he retired as the director of the groundwater division at the Texas Water Development Board. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Water Development Board funds water infrastructure throughout the state. We'll get into the more details about how that works and the differences between how we fund electricity and water infrastructure. But Larry was, spent a lot of his career being intimately involved with, how we develop and fund water infrastructure in Texas. He was with the board for over 30 years. Before working for the board, he had over 30 years of consulting experience associated with groundwater supply and contamination. He's a registered professional geoscientist in Texas and California. His background is, your degree is in geology, is that right? Right. Yeah. It doesn't say where on here. Where'd you get it from?
Bachelor's at University of California at Riverside, and then a master's at UT.
Okay, cool. So got a UT degree in here. Both Mike and I have UT degrees too. So hook 'em. That's right. As is Rob. I see Rob sitting back there smiling.
Yes,
yeah.
This is where the Aggies get.
This is where the Aggies get to. Yeah. Yeah. You got 3 UT degrees up here. Actually 4, because I have 2. 2 from there. Larry was also recently appointed by Governor Abbott to the TexNet Technical Advisory Committee. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, TexNet is the entity that was created to basically observe and kind of make sure that the seismic events that have been occurring because of groundwater injections from hydraulic fracturing don't spread and become larger events. We saw some years ago, had seen some seismic events because of not because of fracking per se, mostly because of groundwater injection from the waste that comes up from it. You have to put it back in the ground. And so that's a very interesting problem. It's one that involves, again, a nexus of water and energy. It's a problem that we've largely solved over the last several years, but is one that still requires monitoring. And TexNet is the kind of state entity that's been set up to monitor and oversee that activity. So sitting right to my left is Mike Nazi. Of course, many of y'all know Mike if you've been around the foundation for any number of years. He's a partner with Jackson Walker LLP, where he practices environmental energy law in Austin, Texas. He's been doing that, both state and federal environmental and energy law, for over 27 years. Focuses energy and air quality as well as electric market rules. And he also teaches are you still teaching a class at UT? Not anymore? Okay, I can't. Off the hook on that. But he has. You're doing U of H now. Okay, so he likes to teach in his spare time, which does not exist, and is also a prolific writer in a lot of journals on environmental and energy law. And of course, as most of you all know, Mike was a director of Life Powered for a couple years He is, partly responsible for me being here. He hired me and Jason Isaac, and we can tell you that he's in addition to being a great lawyer, he's a great salesman. So he convinced us, Jason and I, to come over to TPPF, and we owe our careers to Mike to some extent. So eternally grateful for what he's done for us and continues to do for us. So with that, I'm going to pull out my notes and get us started on the conversation. Should have them pulled out right away.
When he said I hired both he and Jason, you can fill in whatever you like. 1 for 2 ain't bad, right? I'm sure Jason's around here somewhere.
Yeah. I don't know. Actually, I don't see Jason in the audience.
It's kind of a dream team if you think about it.
Yeah.
For those of you who've interacted with him, you've got a pretty wide spectrum of message capability and brain horsepower packed in that package. So it's been a success.
Yeah. I forgot to say about Larry that the way we know Larry around here is that he is Rob Hennicke's father-in-law. Rob and Leslie are back there in the back, and as I always say at TPPF, we may shy away from nepotism, but not reverse nepotism. Many of y'all know that as I got more involved at TPPF, my dad was invited to join the board, as my dad's a board member now. When we needed help on water policy, we called someone's parent, So we look for expertise wherever we can find it, and if it's family, then even better. So anyway, that's my joke for the morning. That's about as good as you're going to get out of me, out of an engineer. So sorry. Okay, so I want to kind of open the conversation by giving people here an overview of how we fund electricity and water infrastructure, because really when you look at how to solve infrastructure problems, really what it boils down to is there's Jason. Now it's not a minute early. Jason Isaac, our former director, back
That's
there.
That's exactly why I hired Jason, because I'm always late and he's just right behind me. It's perfect. Yeah. It's a great team.
Yeah. Anyway, the way that we fund our infrastructure is really determines what gets built, how much gets built, what gets built, and how it gets built, right? So where the money comes from and how it gets used is really the prime driver. If you look at what are the problems with our grid, the problems with our water infrastructure, it really boils down to funding. So I wanted to so I'll start with Mike talking about electricity infrastructure, and I'll just say that even though we funded electricity infrastructure, we fund it through the rates in your bill, right? You pay electric bill, that money goes to fund the infrastructure. That's, until recently, that is solely how we have funded our electricity infrastructure. So the idea that we have a deregulated market in Texas is actually not true. It's a competitive market. Companies compete, but it's heavily regulated in terms of even to an extent how much you pay, but also how that money gets distributed across the system, right? And so just ask Mike to kind of overview, the first how we're funding infrastructure, and then how we funded the grid infrastructure historically, and then how the Texas Energy Fund, which we just passed last year, is now part of the Texas Constitution that says the state is going to help fund electricity infrastructure. How that's kind of a very different from what we've done before, and some might say could be a very risky concept.
Right. I will stay out of the weeds because this is like a 2-hour lecture at a university to talk about the history of how deregulation happened in Texas and California. But here's the high points, right? So in a significant component of the United States still, and Texas before 2000, pretty much all of electricity expenditures, the way people built power plants and moved electrons to your homes, all of that was regulated in the sense that a state commission, appointed or elected depending on the state, would oversee investor-owned utilities who would deploy capital, and they would have a captured service area a regulated monopoly, right? And they would get approval to charge certain amounts for their generation, for their transportation, for their distribution. That's the investor-owned utility side, what you might call the private side. Then there's public power. Cities are a big component of the market nationally and in Texas, and they do it through, I'll go ahead and insert supposedly democratic means, okay? That we are constituents, we elect our city council, they oversee a utility board, and they have accountability that way. So they are often, and most times, although some state commissions regulate them, self-regulating, with only loose regulation from the state, because the idea is that local politics controls and creates accountability there. And then the third is a different kind of public power. I keep them separate, and full transparency, most of my work is done on behalf of this group, which is the Rural Electric Cooperative side of the equation, which is somewhat like public power and city-owned power, but it is a lot more accountable, because those guys sit at a board table every month with their customers, their member cooperatives, and whether or not that board is filled with cowboy hats or not, there's a lot of accountability. And I'm honored to be representing three large generation and transmission cooperatives in this state, and they do an amazing job because of that accountability, right? They hire and maintain staff that are very responsive. So that's what it looked like. And then Texas deregulated the wholesale and the retail side. And this sounds wonky, but trust me, this is not the weeds, okay? Because a lot of people confuse deregulation on the retail side and the wholesale side. Retail deregulation means it's competitive. In other words, we're not going to let people have service territories and a right to, and basically you don't have a choice. You have to actually use that utility. That is still the case in cities and co-ops, okay? So if you're in the city of Austin, sorry, or congrats, depending on, how you look at it. Winter Storm Uri, City of Austin did pretty well because they still had coal. Nobody talks about that. But the reality is that city-owned power, there is no choice. Co-ops, they really don't want choice, but they don't have choice. Investor-owned utility, former service territories were opened up to a wholesale, deregulated retail side. So you get to choose, right to choose, go to a website, monitor. Didn't work out for some all that well in Winter Storm Uri, but it is a great concept and popular when polled, right, for obvious reasons. The wholesale market is completely kind of disconnected from everybody's knowledge, right? When we deregulate the wholesale market, right, those co-ops and cities don't get to opt out. Co-ops and cities can opt into competition on the retail side or out, but the wholesale market is electrons flying over a connected system. You don't get to say, hey, my electrons are going to stay with me. It's all interconnected. So when you deregulate a market, wholesale, you subject all of your public power entities to the same kind of market system that the private side is. And how that has changed things in Texas in particular is that Texas has what's called an energy-only wholesale market. And it's a great concept conceptually for customers because you only pay for the energy that gets produced. You don't pay for insurance. And in the old days, when we had plenty of capacity and there weren't any outside market influences, that worked well. But then production tax credits for renewable energy came in, and they basically have a free ride in an energy-only deregulated market. They're big promoters of energy-only deregulated markets for obvious reasons, okay? They don't have to pay infrastructure costs, they get a free ride into the market, and they get paid for every electron so much that it is oftentimes, in fact, the majority of the time, more than what the wholesale power price is. And we'll talk later about necessary reforms in order to mitigate those impacts because that has caused a huge problem in Texas. It has eroded the revenue streams necessary to maintain power plants because we've undercut the wholesale market price of power. This is going to sound weird for a bunch of pro-market people, too much. And so that's that truly is the high level. I think Brent's probably chuckling and like, yeah, that probably is the high level, but he asked for too much there. But that's where we were. A lot of states are still where Texas used to be, and a lot of states have actually done what Texas did and actually are considering retracting. And I think a lot of our conversation moving forward in relationship to this new program that's been passed is how close are we to going back to that model? And are we kind of somewhat doing that with this new bill? So I'll stop there, Brent.
Yeah, and we'll kind of save the energy fund conversation for talking about the solution set, I guess, and switch over to Larry. So that's our electricity infrastructure. So Larry, kind of compare how water infrastructure in Texas has historically been funded, and what are some? Well, I guess we'll talk about the water fund. You could elaborate on that a little bit too, if you want.
Sure, yeah, and I'll get to the water fund in a little bit more, but just there are two things I would start off talking about with water. First of all, water is heavy, and that means it takes a lot of effort to move it around. And so that's just one thing to always keep in mind when you're talking water infrastructure. It's a big effort. It's a little heavier than electrons, so that distinguishes. There's a lot of connection between electricity and water. They need each other, but that's one thing to keep in mind whenever you're talking about water. It's heavy. The other thing I'd mention, just as foundational, is water is personal. My background's in groundwater. Of course, in groundwater, many of you probably know groundwater is owned by the landowner, so that makes it super personal. But even with surface water, I think people take a kind of a personal connection to it. And so when you're talking about moving water and infrastructure, you're dealing with some public perception issues and interests that are oftentimes difficult to deal with. So anyway, water's heavy, water's personal. So that's just two things I always like to keep in mind when I'm talking about water and thinking about it. In terms of infrastructure and how historically that has been done, the kind of the dividing line in history is the year 1957. And why is that year? That is the year that the Texas Water Development Board, or its predecessor agency, came into being. When you look at major changes in water policy or initiatives, particularly from the legislature, all you have to do is follow the drought cycle. As many of you know, the 1950s was a terrible drought in Texas, and that there was very serious economic losses and so forth. Real concern from the legislature on how to deal with water in the state. So as a consequence of that, and there had been some water agencies before that, but basically the Water Development Board, or its predecessor agency, was established then with the idea that it would be a funding agency to help promote development of water supplies, hence the name, development of water supplies throughout the state, to ensure that people would not be running out of water, and to offer attractive financing for various entities, public entities, to deal with that. Previous to that, it's probably individual cities and water supply corporations would handle that through like municipal bonds or private equity or capital. But when the state got involved, they were able to create programs for financing, and today there's probably roughly a dozen different programs that the Water Development Board offers to help local entities finance water. Now, not everybody in the state uses the Water Development Board. There's still many other options available, but quite a few, and particularly those communities that are more challenged, particularly rural communities that may not have the financial ability to do that all on their own, so they turn to the state, which can offer, through various programs, attractive loans, sometimes principal forgiveness, maybe a part of that equation for those communities. They have programs for economically disadvantaged communities, and so forth. So we can probably talk about that later, and you can go to the Water Development Board website for that. But currently, probably the Water Development Board is the primary funding agency for water infrastructure in the state. Not solely. There are big exceptions to that, of course. Probably since in the last 65 years or so, the board has funded roughly 6,000 different projects. So they've had a pretty hefty portfolio. And I think it's been totaled, what I recall is about $35 billion worth of infrastructure projects. Of course, if you've seen projections about what the needs of the state are, they're even greater than that off in the future. And so that's been, as Brent mentioned, we've had some recent developments to help address those kinds of needs. Texas is growing. Projections are, what are we, 30 million or so population? I didn't check on that, but roughly. I don't know what it was in 1957, but I bet it was under 10 million. And in the next 50 years, we'll probably double, roughly, probably over 50 million. So, and none of those people are bringing any water with them. So, I mean, I came.
Or electrons.
Or electrons, yeah. So we ought to require, no, I better not, but I moved to Texas almost 50 years ago to go to UT, and we didn't bring any water with us, so I'm sure nobody else does either. So anyway, that's kind of the basics there.
Yeah, and go ahead and go into a little bit about I guess the state water plan, and also then the water fund that was recently just enacted last year, and kind of how those recent developments have been something of a change from the more localized planning process that has existed historically.
Sure. Yeah, in terms of the state water plan, the state has had water plans ever since the Water Development Board was established, and kind of in the old days, before 1997 or so, the state, right over here, just a couple blocks away, you'd have groups of engineers and geologists, and they would do their studies, and they would develop projections of water availability normally on a county level, but sometimes a regional level, and so forth. And it was always what we'd call a top-down planning approach. Back after another drought in the mid-90s, that system was completely changed. So then, and since then, the state's water planning efforts have basically been operated on a regional basis. There are 16 different regions in Texas. Each region is responsible for developing plans for their region, and they look at what their current supplies are of water, what their population growths are, and various other factors, and they develop projections of whether they need additional water, and they all do typically, and then they develop strategies to help address those needs, help address those deficits. So those 16 regions are drawn more or less on river basin boundaries. There's some exceptions to that, and they oftentimes will cut the corners on counties and so forth. But each of those regions are, and it's legislatively defined membership of those groups to represent different interests, such as cities, agricultural, industry, probably electric generation, I believe is maybe one of them, environmental. So they each have these citizen groups that come together with the aid of consultants to develop these plans. They then submit those plans to the Water Development Board, which basically rolls them up into one document called the State Water Plan, and that happens every 5 years. So basically, it's always going on. There's always work going on the water planning side. Those strategies and projects that are identified in the State Water Plan can then be eligible to be funded by the state from a program that came into being a little over 10 years ago called the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, SWIFT, they call it the SWIFT program. And that program has been really kind of turbocharged the financing of projects, because prior to that, people said, well, that's wonderful, we've got all these plans, but where's the implementation? Where are the projects? You know, planning's great, but if you're not going to do anything with it, what's the point? So the passage of the SWIFT program, which was a constitutional amendment, basically, was voted on by the citizens of the state, and funded from the rainy day fund, basically. That basically kind of turbocharged the effort to get these projects built and underway. And so there have been a number of very significant projects that have been developed or are being developed using the SWIFT funding. And everything from one water well, for example, for a community, to a multi-billion-dollar projects, like in the Houston or the Dallas area, have been funded. So it's really a kind of across-the-board effort. Then this last session, the continuing to be motivated by the projections for economic growth, the fact that without water, there's no economic growth. And there's a lot of concern about stories that have happened over the last decade or more of communities being challenged on water issues, a lot of attention being raised concerning failures of various water systems just because they're aging infrastructure and leaky pipes and all that. And the estimates of roughly 136 billion gallons of water lost through leaks every year, which if you added that all up, it would be, that kind of water would supply the city of Austin, I think Lubbock, and a couple other cities, their supply for the year. So it's a significant issue. And so an additional program called the Texas Water Fund was established this past year, again voted on this past November, received an overwhelming majority of support, which will again fund water projects, and we'll talk about that more in detail, I guess, as we go on.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
One thing, Brent, I'd point out about the, just super high level for everybody, the water plan, the Texas Water Plan, it's kind of full circle for me because I literally have just lived in the between water and power where I started as a water lawyer and kind of never stopped being one because power plants, make steam to spin turbines, right? So it is world renowned. Like it is seen as a model across the world. I have partners that practice in Australia and Europe, and people look to the Texas water planning process as the first of its kind on a massive scale. And so it is definitely something to be proud of. Doesn't mean it's perfect and we should never tweak it, and the other thing I'll clarify is this is not a handout program. This is a program that makes money more accessible and affordable, but it does not grant dollars in huge chunks. It is leveraging the state's full faith and credit and the rainy day fund, which is kind of a funny phrase, right? It's like the not so rainy day fund, all right? But sometimes it needs to be used for flood protection too, so that's a different thing. But anyway, it is used to, those dollars are levered, and we'll get into that, how that works when we talk about both of the electricity and the water programs moving forward. But I just want you all to know that it has been a point of pride, and frankly bipartisan pride, because it really is seen as a first of its kind at scale, and then converting it into actual funding is a big deal. In the water world, we say making the big I a little I. It's a great idea, but unless you actually have the funding apparatus, implementation, the little I, is always the hardest, and we have a great track record of that success.
Yeah, and so just to kind of reiterate, the idea of having a state planning process for water, some level of state funding, or at least state backing for infrastructure. Generally speaking, almost all water infrastructure is backed by tax dollars. It's a question of, local, state, federal, right? Of course, electricity, not the case. We've always funded electricity through your rates, right? So that's a big difference between those two, I think, is just what I wanted to highlight. So, and that kind of brings me to the next kind of question, which is the energy fund that we passed just this past year. What is the problem that's trying to be solved there, and then how is that just it's a big departure from how we've done things in the past. And you made your point about how we're kind of tilting back toward more of the model that we had prior to the late 90s.
Right, so, I'm going to be diplomatic about this fund because it is absolutely well-intentioned, and we have an emergency situation, and our public officials need to be responsive to emergencies. So make that the only quote if you're going to quote me in the speech, okay? But I'm going to say some things that are going to sound maybe borderline critical because we have other problems to solve in this power market. All right. What has happened in Texas because of our energy-only market is that we do not value, put a price on, or pay insurance for capacity in any way, shape, or form. That creates a reliable system. If you have a robust system with lots of thermal dispatchable power, meaning coal and nuclear and gas, then it kind of works itself out. But what has happened with the influence of production tax credits and the driving down of what wind and solar frankly cost in the market, not the true and total cost, but what they cost in the market because they're subsidized and transmission is also subsidized. I'll talk about that in a second. You basically strip the revenues away from nuclear, gas, and coal. And so when you strip revenues away from generators who have multi-$100 million maintenance budgets, you lose them. And they have retired. Some of those units get old and they retire. That's what happens with manufacturing and power plants. But most of the power plants that have retired in our market have retired prematurely, before their engineered useful life. And it's not just been coal, it's been gas. And one of the biggest myths nationally is that, oh, Texas is building a bunch of natural gas. I can't tell you. For the last 15 years, I've been all over the country working in multiple states, and everybody would tell me, including some really smart consultants, all of this gas that's getting built in Texas. Well, we at Life Powered kind of had to show the dirty little secret is that we have retired gas and we built some peaking gas, but we have not replaced the gas we've retired. We have netted a reduction in gas. In the natural gas capital of at least America, awash in natural gas and infrastructure, we have figured out a way to not build the power plants that can use our own fuel. And the reason is because and I've been in the board meetings and the banking meetings where this happens. When a bank is deciding whether to deploy their capital or whatever source of equity, and they look at a market that has a day-ahead bidding market and a real-time bidding market where the majority of the bids are below zero because of the influence of the production tax credit, they're not going to deploy their capital there. You can't make money. You can't even make marginal money in the Texas market investing in capital in a power plant that is competing against heavy subsidies, okay, and has no capacity valuation or doesn't get paid for its attributes to the grid, whether it be voltage support or inertia or just, pesky little detail being there when it gets really hot or really cold. There is nothing. And that was a highly efficient model before the production tax credit. But when you combine it with the production tax credit, it strips revenues. And so the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and the leadership all came down after much wrangling about a lot of different ideas to say we're gonna put some dollars, it's a pretty significant amount of dollars, okay, it's in the billions, plural, up to leverage the same kind of funding type of approach we've had for water. I will tell you, as somebody who's worked in Larry's world, they cross some boundaries that we would never cross in the water world about potentially having grants directly to private entities, raises a lot of interesting policy questions, but for sure responsive to an emergency because we are growing in demand. Texas isn't just growing, if you look at the national statistics, if you look at demand for electricity per capita, you saw this lovely period of time where that was dropping because of energy efficiency and just overall efficiency, but the advent of cloud computing, everybody having an iPhone, everybody streaming everything, AI coming on, data centers, we have reversed that trend. And electric cars, we haven't even seen the beginning of that trend yet, okay? And we have already bottomed the curve, and nationally, we are already increasing our per capita usage of electricity for the first time in 15 to 20 years. And that trend should scare everybody because we haven't been doing the same thing on the power generation side, right? So our public officials are trying to be responsive to that. In Texas, that trend is dramatic. I'm gonna give you a statistic that very few people know about. There's a document buried at ERCOT, that's the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It tracks large load interconnection requests. When a company wants to expand or a data center wants to locate or an electric car battery manufacturer wants to locate, they put in a request for interconnection to the grid. So you cannot count every megawatt in that stack, but you can put a discount factor on it. The current stack at ERCOT, okay, I'm gonna give you two statistics. Our peak demand in the hottest and coldest time is just shy of what? We're at 90,000 megawatts, maybe 85, right? So like I tell people they better bank on 90 because it's going to be there like that. So let's just say it's 80. Let's be modest. There is 40,000 megawatts of large load interconnection pending at ERCOT. That's fully half of the total peaking capacity, arguably, of our market. Now, not all those megawatts will get built. Cut it in half, it's still a whopper number, right? And I'll tell you why I know it's a real number is because my co-op clients see that at the grassroots level. Now, I can't tell you who they are. It's all protected by confidentiality. They would never tell who their customers are, but they're seeing 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatt load interconnection requests throughout their cooperative territories. And it adds up to 20 to 25 real gigawatts of new power demand. So that was a sidebar, but everybody needs to understand that I will critique this mechanism as not being full, and Brent and I certainly share this view that more needs to be done, but our policy leaders are responding to an emergency because that 86, 85 is about to be 92, 95, maybe 105, and it takes 3 to 4 to 5 years to build a gas plant. So they were desperate to get something into the place to be able to bring revenue to a market that has not been able to attract investment. Banks are not investing in the ERCOT market to build gas plants because they don't make enough money and there's other places they can make their money. And so we had to figure out a stopgap measure. This was one idea and it's being deployed.
We'll see if it works. Big question mark. Yeah, so before we get into more of kind of the set of solutions that we talk about regarding the grid and that some of y'all have heard in previous years when we've done this panel, I just wanted to kind of give Larry a few more minutes to talk about the thing about electricity is that we have a ton of energy in Texas, right? Of all kinds, you name it, right? Oil, gas. We have uranium deposits in Texas. We have just a lot of different ways that we can produce energy, that we can produce electricity in Texas. The challenges with the energy market are primarily federal policy driven, right? The good news is that those policies can be changed or fixed or countered, right? Water has less of that issue, although the EPA and NEPA are a problem to building infrastructure. Those problems are less of a challenge in the water market. The issue with water is that we don't have nearly as much to start with. Yeah, and trying to get new sources is very difficult. So kind of go into some of that, like what are some of the ways that we're trying to get new sources to allow more transfer of water from east to west and so on, and how that's being done right now.
Yeah, sure. So this is probably a good time to talk about the Texas Water Fund, which was put into place basically last legislative session, Senate Bill 28 and I think Senate Joint Resolution 175, basically were the mechanisms to establish the Texas Water Fund. Basically went to the Texas voters and was passed by, well, probably close to 80% margin. So it is now a fact. There's this new Texas Water Fund. It was funded by $1 billion to leverage, basically loans for all sorts of water projects, anything from conservation to new traditional water projects and so forth. Again, motivated by, I would say the one number that pretty much stands out that was referenced in the establishment of this fund was 7 million. And 7 million is the shortfall that's predicted in water supplies over the next 50 years from the state water plan, the compilation of all those regional plans. 7 million acre feet of water is what Texas needs to meet the projected needs going forward. Now, to put that in scale, that's about roughly half of what we use every year anyway. So that's really a very substantial, kind of like the electric business, a very substantial need for additional water. So the Texas Water Fund is basically, there was another fund created as part of that, which is called, I believe it's a New Water Supply for Texas Fund. And that fund is basically 25% of the $1 billion, so $250 million, is dedicated strictly for the development of new water supplies. So the question was to the Water Development Board, which is responsible for administrating this program, is how do you define new water? What is that? So there's been discussion of that. The board is having a series of kind of stakeholder meetings, public meetings to get input and so forth. Just recently, or in fact earlier this month, the chairman of the Senate Water Agriculture Rural Affairs Committee, Senator Charles Perry, provided the Water Development Board with a letter describing the legislative intent of what the new water supply fund really means according to what they're thinking. So what that letter, and it's available on the Water Development Board's website if you want to look through the details of it, but it basically says new water isn't conservation water. I mean, conservation is great, it's needed, but basically it's not water that's just moved around the state. It's not water from East Texas to move to West Texas or what have you. That's not new water. New water is basically water that has not been currently in that cycle already. And so there's different programs that this fund is particularly focused on. That would include what's called aquifer storage and recovery, which isn't really a water generating, but it's a water saving approach. So that's one category. Another category would be produced water, which is the water, Brent mentioned earlier, the water that is produced as part of oil field production. A lot of times we call these wells that produce oil, we call them oil wells. Well, if you really think about it, they're really water wells with some oil in it. Typically, any oil well, what we call oil well, will produce, for every barrel of oil, it's probably 4 to 7 or more barrels of water that's produced. Now that water's not drinkable. It's much saltier than seawater. It's got a lot of other stuff in it. But, and so the oil industry's done a pretty good job of looking into how they recycle it and they use it for additional stimulating production and so forth. But there's even when you account for that, there's a whole lot of water left over. That water then goes into, basically is injected into the subsurface in saltwater disposal wells. And then you get into issues of induced seismicity and so forth. But what if you could use that water? What if you could use it for some purposes for treatment? There's a lot of effort going into looking at what are usable. It's probably not going to be drinking water, or at least that's going to be a big challenge. But it could be used for maybe certain agricultural purposes and others. So that's a new water source that we're looking into. In fact, there's a couple of sessions ago, a organization called the Texas Water Consortium, Produced Water Consortium, was established in Lubbock, and they've had a good, they're doing some pilot studies, and they've been looking at, they're a group formed of academics, industry, and state agencies that kind of work together collaboratively to solve that problem. The other source, another source that's mentioned, particularly by Senator Perry, is looking at out-of-state water. So let's look at the states around Texas. New Mexico, where are we going to get water from New Mexico? Not likely. No, there's no water there. In fact, there's already been legal issues. We're at the Rio Grande, which we won't go into that one. But Oklahoma, no. So we're looking at Louisiana has been very. They have more water than they know what to do with there. And I know the Sabine River Authority of Louisiana, the river that forms the boundary between Texas and Louisiana, they have been looking actively at the possibility of selling water to Texas. So I'm sure there's many other things that are in the works there, but out-of-state water is probably, if you're going to reach that 7 million acre feet per year goal, and that's a goal that really the legislation describes as they want to meet that in 10 years. That's a high pole vaulting goal to get over. That's probably a lot of that water would be imported water. So we'll see how that goes.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, and I think before we kick it over to questions, I just wanted to give Mike a few more minutes to kind of explain. You know, I want to make sure we gave Larry some time as well, but to explain kind of further what he meant by, what you meant by, okay, we've got this energy fund now to, to inject some money into the system, but we know the system's still very broken. So what are some of the things that we need to do to, to fix the electricity markets as they exist, or to completely do we need to start thinking about completely changing the process, and also what's needed to fight back against the problem being created by the federal government, most notably the EPA. Right.
So the first thing to say is that this is not a unique problem for Texas, but Texas may be uniquely situated to actually do something about it. Texas, one of the benefits of ERCOT being entirely within the state is it is not subject to FERC jurisdiction. We don't actually have to go through a federal agency which is chocked full of just, all kinds of bureaucratic hurdles and constituencies that have big lobbyists. And we can make policy that kind of protects Texans, right? But that also puts a responsibility on us to do something about it when it's broken. And, there's one of the most annoying myths I hear nationally when I go to other states is, oh, if ERCOT was interconnected with the rest of the grid, Winter Storm Uri would have been okay. For any of you who have been tempted to believe that stat, just, you don't even actually have to be good at algebra, just arithmetic, okay? The states around Texas, too deep, okay? Couldn't have supplied the power. By the way, storms aren't local. They don't stay within a state. Everybody was short on power. Everybody got devastated throughout the Midwest. The other states have nothing to give us, okay, especially when they're short too. But, this is a Texas. We're at the Public Policy Foundation. Let's give some proud statistics. But this is a really important thing that shapes into why Texas needs to do this reform, because everybody is looking at Texas. Because Texas's power market, the big one that I talked about that's about to get even bigger, is bigger than the next 3 power-consuming and producing states combined. Okay? California, Florida, and Ohio. Okay? We use more electricity to make stuff in Texas, which is fully half of the power we use, than the next 4 manufacturing states combined. We are an entire country when it comes to power because we are still a maker state. Environmental groups like to say we're the China of America. I'll take Texas over China any day because we also have an extraordinarily clean environment because we've deployed technology, right? But what we have to do on the market is we can't just think about chasing subsidies with subsidies, period, full stop. The way you fix a distorted market is you figure out a way to mitigate the role of subsidies, not adding to the problem. So that means, and Brent, very humbly over here, for those of you who know him, very humble compared to the brain power he has come up with an idea along with another compatriot of ours, and we have developed at least one of 2 really good ideas to try to mitigate that. It's called cost allocation. It's called, if you impose a cost on the grid as a generation type, it needs to be factored in to what you get paid by the market. If you are not there when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, then you can't just have a free ride. You need to be responsible and accountable for dispatchability when we need it most. If a gas-fired generation plant does not show up when we're in a big cold storm, guess what? Not only do they not get paid, they have to replace their power. And that's why Brazos Electric went bankrupt. That's why the biggest gas-fired utilities all lost billions of dollars during Uri. Didn't make them. The market was set up for them to make the only money they were ever going to make in our market should have been made during Uri, but they didn't because they had to replace their capacity when they didn't get gas. That consequence does not exist for renewable energy, and this is not an anti-renewable energy issue. It's about cost allocation. It's called, the principle in utility law world is cost causation. And so the legislature in Texas has set in motion for the first time in any state in the nation a process of deploying a firming requirement, which is basically the other side of cost allocation, that if you are not going to be fully dispatchable and creditable at peak, you need to secure a backup. Batteries can play. Gas-fired generation peakers can play. Other thermal capacities can play. It'll create a revenue stream for that. It's not enough because we still have this market distortion of negative pricing. We need to address negative pricing. We can't have the wholesale price of electricity require a nuclear power plant to have to pay to stay online, because that's what happens in Texas. Every day when demand is soft in our state, big nuclear power and coal plants and baseload gas plants have to pay to stay online. Gas plants and to a certain extent coal plants can just turn off and not pay. We don't want our nuke plants to have to go up and down, okay? So that problem has to be fixed. We actually have a really good idea brewing. We're studying it. We're gonna make sure it doesn't have any adverse consequences, and I think you're gonna see something proposed at the commission here very soon on that. Very excited about that. And another great example of how TPPF is out trying to solve problems, not just identifying problems. You know, don't ever accept that. You know, like, what's your solution? Like, there's more solutions going on than, you know, 100 square yards here than anybody could ever hope for. So you know, good on you, as they say in Australia. So we do need to fix some things. We have 2 ideas. That's a pretty high-level summary of them. Let's get to Q&A.
Yeah. All right. So we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. So Mike's back there. We'll get one of y'all in the back there, and then we'll get John here up front.
I
And
read an article.
Please end your,
My name's
your
George
question
Pond,
with a question mark.
and I read an article in Wall Street Journal the other day that the CEO of Chevron is looking how important gas energy is to the new development of AI and the intensity that is going to be needed in the laboratories that are continuing to develop AI, just like they're doing with blockchain. And I would think that Texas would be a prime place for all of this. How does this reserve thing that y'all are looking at in terms of building on the megawatts, how is that going to connect into that kind of industry?
It's a great question. So part of that big 40,000 megawatt stack, you can bet, is AI related, okay? Nobody knows. It's all confidential. We'll find out soon enough. The answer is not going to be peaking gas plants, okay? This is an emergency measure. This fund is going to bring on small peaking gas. We need large spinning mass natural gas fired generation. We need to maintain our coal fleet, and we need to build more nuclear. We cannot just be a subservient fleet to renewables, because the sheer volume of what AI would consume in increased demand is not sustainable with a system that is basically betting on the weather and hoping that we can deploy gas when we need it desperately. Gas-fired combined cycle power is an extraordinarily efficient way to make electricity, and nobody's building it right now except a couple of regulated market exceptions. And this fund will not build it. This fund will only build peakers. And so in some ways, I don't want to see us stop here, because we're really playing into a federal agenda that EPA is being deployed to make happen, which is they're proposing to restrict gas plants. They're trying to stop the construction of new plants, and they're going to have a new set of rules on existing gas to basically limit them to have low capacity factors, meaning they're subservient to the renewable fleet. And hey, some may believe that's the way our fleet should run, but they're not looking at the true and total cost of that. It's a highly inefficient way to run the fleet, and we burn gas so cleanly, and we have pollution controls that are so robust across our entire thermal fleet, it makes no environmental sense to do it that way. So the answer is increased demand. AI is in the center of it. Again, we haven't even started about transportation electrification. Okay, we're on the very front end of that, so that number is about to really explode.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for being here. So really appreciate the work that you're doing, keeping the thoughts kind of going. I had like a bifurcated question, and George, you kind of nailed it. We pay people not to use energy in those times where it's really critical, right? And we have an enormous crypto, the blockchain contingency that seems to keep growing. We have a lot of power here. They can seem to consume a ton. They get paid not to produce. At the same time, I was kind of curious now, it doesn't seem to stop. The wind and solar continue to grow, right? They're prolific here. I understand we have 3 interconnections with FERC. If we did, or that was explored, can we let them go compete and let them sell their energy off? We would be making, and we would be net revenue or generating here. Let them go compete, and then incentivize the gas, since we have tons of it, to come on to be able to meet the chip manufacturing that's coming on with chip, the AI stuff that's coming down, the blockchain that seems to be growing. Is that feasible?
Well,
thank you.
The answer is, if we could figure out a way to export power without getting federal jurisdiction and the overlord of the federal government that we are excused from right now, we would do it, right? Because Texas exports, I mean, it is a maker state. It exports all kinds of products and fuels and chemicals, right? Why not electrons? The problem is that comes with such baggage that I would never, certainly not in my career, I can't ever envision it being justified. It would cause, I work in states that are FERC regulated. Absolute, unmitigated nightmare. Just add, right next to EPA, FERC, okay, on your list of problems. We don't actually have a FERC problem. We do in some ways, but so that's just not capable of happening and without the offset of FERC jurisdiction. And there's also an issue of they still are going to be generating and dispatching into the Texas market. So that we have to figure out, even if we do have a robust export market one day magically without having to have FERC jurisdiction, maybe we'll figure out a way to do that, we still have to mitigate the consequences of them driving the price of electricity back below zero when they're dispatching here. So it's a very tricky problem. We think we have a pretty innovative solution to it, which is, we'll see how it plays out. That might actually even allow that to happen long term because Texas, as long as its market functions more rationally, can tolerate import and export freedom. But complicated question. It's definitely well-intentioned where you're going. It makes logical sense because we export so much else. But all of the regulators and policymakers in this space have just shied away from it because of the jurisdictional difficulties it creates for Texas.
So I live close to a town that I've gotten close to. And it's a beat-up little town, and their water infrastructure is lousy. They have boil alerts at least twice a month, which means they lose pressure in their system, and contaminants could have come in. The sewer plant's a disaster. If I showed you a picture, you'd vomit. It's died 28 times, which means all the bacteria that turns wastewater into relatively clean water and leaves a sludge behind. The bacteria dies because the plant isn't working right, okay? Then we have found PFAS in the sludge that they sell for fertilizer. And PFAS doesn't go away, it's a byproduct of plastics. So, I gave you the situation. To get any more water out of the ground, the Prairie Land Water Authority put meters on our wells, and it goes back to 2018 where we told them what our highest water usage was, and they stuck us there, and we're stuck there. It ain't going away. We're stuck there. We're at the edge of the expanding megaplex, which is the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And to get groundwater in, because they've capped our well capacity to take from the aquifers, we're facing 17 miles at $1 million a mile, which is about what it costs to run water pipe for large use. And we're stuck. We're just stuck. And I don't live there, but the people who live there suffer without clean water. They suffer exploding manholes because if it rains, it overflows and flushes sewage up through the manhole. And I'm speaking not only for the little town I'm by, I'm speaking for almost 217 other towns in Texas who are having a water crisis without a road out because the giant cities seem to be getting all the attention. So do you have any help for me?
Well, and that's a very common problem. I've heard about those problems, and particularly I forget what the percentage is, but the Water Development Board was supposed to have a targeted amount of their funding devoted to rural communities because of those problems that you have there. Now, the Water Development Board does have a number of programs that are based on state revolving funds for clean and drinking water that would be available to communities to deal with sewage treatment plants and water treatment plants and so forth.
We're constantly being fined by TCEQ.
Yeah, so that's the way out there is to have those communities get help from the Water Development Board to fund those the upgrades or the replacements of those facilities. Ultimately, the costs for that are going to be by the ratepayers. That ultimately that's where that comes from. But the Water Development Board does have. There are other ways to do it, but the Water Development Board does have very attractive loan rates for that kind of, and depending on the situation, there can be principal forgiveness and various other mechanisms to make it easier. Now, in terms of limiting groundwater supplies, and that's kind of a whole nother issue, dealing with the basically and this is really kind of gets off into a different world of groundwater planning that is based on a kind of a desired condition for an aquifer to exist. And sometimes that has been used, that planning procedure has been used to set basically production limits for aquifers, where you're in a groundwater conservation district there. You're in what, Cleburne area? Yeah. So that's a different area than trying to fix the infrastructure, but I would advise just to get involved with a local groundwater planning group, your local board there. I can talk to you afterwards on a person to talk to. I know the head of that Prairie Lands district there. Yes, Kathy Turner Jones. She's a good person to work with. But I would say that there are programs available to help on the wastewater and infrastructure issues. Yeah.
Okay, right there.
This is a related water question. So I'm on the board of directors for the Brazos River Authority, and we're trying to permit Allen Creek Reservoir. We've been told by our consultants it's 7 years to get the construction permit through the Corps of Engineers, and there's 1,200 people moving to Texas every day. And so, you know, any of these surface water sources that we're trying to build are a long ways off. We have the compliance districts for groundwater that say you got to go to surface water because we don't want subsidence. And you mentioned that there's 137 million gallons that's leaks. Maybe, is there a way that we can prioritize the spending in the short term in recovering the leaks, because that's also been chlorinated and, you know, is usable, drinkable, potable, a way to somehow prioritize maybe the SWIFT funding or something to address leaks in the city of Houston, you know, as a first step with the water that we have. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, that is I would say it's a high priority, fixing the aging infrastructure, the leaking infrastructure, because you've already basically paid for that water and you're just losing it. So that's kind of relatively low-hanging fruit. Now, it's expensive to replace pipes and so forth, but that's certainly with the board, that is a high priority. And if you look in their monthly board meetings, if you look and see the kind of projects they're typically dealing with, pretty much every month they're funding some sort of repair, replacement, line replacement, and those are necessary projects. So that's very, very much a high priority is stopping the leaks. That's an important priority. I'd agree with you on that. And you're right about permitting of getting the permits and all the hoops to jump through on surface water reservoirs. I mean, sometimes that's a generation that it takes to. So the heyday of reservoirs are pretty much behind us. I mean, there's a few that are under construction and are on planning, but not many like they were back in the 60s and 70s. So.
I have two quick questions. One, simple one. Is the reality the lack of water going to stop Texas's growth in population? We can't, we've already talked about can't meet the supply at the rate we're going. We're going to have major subsidies, et cetera. Is it really going to just basically come to a day that we're going to have to stop the growth of population, or it will subsequently do that? Second question, have we spent too much money on subsidies for alternate energy, specifically windmills and solar? We've subsidized it to the extent that anything that's that non-economic, and you're shutting out economic businesses and not having a competitive market. Isn't it time that we reduce the subsidies for wind and solar and encourage other kinds of building, like you're talking about, gas plants, et cetera? I would also suggest small nuclear. We should be a leader in this country in developing small, efficient nuclear peak plants. I'm not saying build the old Comanche peaks of the past. That seems to me that we could take that subsidy money and create a whole new industry that would put Texas at the leadership of everything?
Well, we'll tag team. This is the answer. I'll take the first one. Is that basically you're right. There certainly is a threat. If we don't do anything about water infrastructure, that is definitely a threat to our economic growth. And so the state leadership is taking a very serious look at that, and the citizens have backed them up on terms of funding the infrastructure. One thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about options, desal. Desal of seawater and brackish groundwater is another item on that menu that may help us out quite a bit in certain local areas. But you're right, that the state leadership has recognized that if we don't do something about water, that puts the brakes on everything. So it's critically important.
And if you I'll transition into your power question with the comment about the water. If we don't start funding water, authorizing the usage of dollars to leverage funding for water, again, we're not spending money directly on it, we're leveraging the rainy day fund. If that doesn't start ticking up to be commiserate with increased demand, we've got a problem. $1 billion this session on water, $10 billion on power. Was that the right breakdown? Our leaders they're responding to an emergency. They responded. They should all be patted on the back. But every session, water should be getting more money. Okay, period, full stop. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it that way, and we can talk details later. The question of subsidies is twofold. One, federal government, policy-wise, we need to completely reframe, the concept of utilizing subsidies for energy, right? And if anybody has not read Brent Bennett's piece about kind of all-in subsidies, who gets what, how much per BTU, you've missed out, because I've worked in this space for 31 years. I have never seen anyone do a deep analysis of the true and total, all in, who's getting subsidized. There's so many talking points about, oh, fossil energy gets subsidized. Well, look at it then. Let's even be generous and call it a subsidy. It's tax policy that mitigates against risk. I don't think it's a subsidy, but let's call it a subsidy, and then let's actually compare what it does in energy systems to compare to what we do. So we gotta fix that on the federal government. But we can't fix the federal government, we figured out, overnight, even in Texas. So we have to figure out, and what we are doing, Brent, another really smart guy, myself and some others, are trying to construct a way, if those subsidies are gonna be allowed to persist, and Texas can't stop that from happening, we need to make sure that they are deployed in our markets in a way that values reliability, not just dumps money into the pockets of rich equity investors at the punishment of reliability and resilience, right? So there's a way to do that. You gotta be careful, can't be anti-competitive, it can't be discriminatory. It's about valuing real things that the market should reward, and we will pass legal muster. But I started with this and I'll end it with it. The solution is not to chase subsidies with subsidies. And this temporary emergency measure that we just deployed through this emergency fund, I sure hope is the end of it. Because the state, if it's going to get into paying and getting into supporting a kind of system, we're just kind of committing the same sin in a different way. Emergency response, yes. Long term, we got to fix the market to be undistorted, and we have to figure out a balancing mechanism. And Texas, I can tell you, I work in a lot of other states. Everybody's waiting to see what Texas does now that we passed the bill, right? The bill puts in motion these reforms, thanks to the hard work of Jason and Brent and Life Powered and TPPF. It had and the leadership of the Lieutenant Governor's office, a lot of really good people made it happen. Now we actually got to go do it. Frankly, we had to wait, in order to get it through the House, it had to be pushed back. But it's still in law. It's in motion. And a couple of other things we add to that, and we could actually find a solution that could be deployed. Because this problem, we are the cautionary tale for the country. Everybody is right behind us. The entire Southwest Power Pool is looking at Texas to fix this problem because they don't know how.
Yeah. Okay, time for one more question in the back there.
So I live in Midland, and we have a water district that was formed 10 years ago. And in 10 years, they've been collecting property taxes, but they have done no infrastructure whatsoever. Is there anything you can do as a constituent to try to force the water district to either stop collecting taxes or actually provide the services that they were formed to do?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I think, probably citizen involvement. Is that an elected board that runs that district? And yeah, it seems like I would certainly want to know what they're doing with the money they're collecting. Certainly, it seems like the purpose of that district would be to basically provide water or to facilitate the provision of water for its constituents. So yeah, that sounds like a particular issue there. But I'd say getting involved with the local district and sorting that out. I don't know what other avenues you might have there at the local board, but I would definitely get involved. Maybe you have been already, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure what other mechanism you might have available there.
I mean,
I'd want to understand what the purpose of the taxes are and what they're actually using them for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good summary of, what can we do? And the answer is, we get involved. I have chosen to get involved with a portion of my career. Those of y'all here get involved by, getting on local boards and, enacting change or, helping people that are on your local boards enact change. And, and the foundation is here as a resource, both as an information resource and also as a way to, I look at us as a way of aggregating the money and support all of you could give individually into something that's much greater than the sum of the parts. That's what, so that's what we try to do at the foundation, is to take all your voices and take that to the legislature or to DC or to other states increasingly as well, and to give your voice by combining your voice with the voice of others. We try to make it more effective and more directed and actually enact real policy change. So I'm really proud to have the chance to work at the foundation with guys like Mike and Larry, and we always encourage y'all to get more involved in any way that you see fit for yourself. But I'll end with the final note that, as much as we've talked about the problems of meeting, the growing demands of our state, I want to, it's important to note that, as kind of Larry pointed out too, we have, to this point, we have met the demands of everyone moving to Texas. We've been doing this for a long time. The entrepreneurs, the people making the markets happen every day, know how to get it done. I grew up in Midland in a time when we thought oil and gas production was going to go away eventually. I got out of the business and moved away because I didn't think there's much of a future there. But guess what? We found a way to get more energy out of the ground. We're finding ways to get more water in here and meet demand. So I always have a hope of optimism that people will not accept energy scarcity, water scarcity, whatever. They're going to demand that those needs to be met and find ways, and entrepreneurs and people out there are going to find ways to do it. So it's incumbent upon us in the policy space to create an environment for consumers to have their needs met and for entrepreneurs to succeed in doing that. And so that way we all prosper. So thanks again for everything that you do to contribute to that and for coming here today. So.